Before we get started, I'd like to recognize some special guests that we have in the audience tonight. And I'll begin with our great Ventura County Supervisor, Peter Foy. Peter, thank you for coming. Our Ventura County Clerk, Mark Lund. Mark. The wife of our outstanding Congressman, Elton Gallegly, Janice Gallegly. Janice. And, of course, Duke Blackwood, the director of our Reagan Library. Duke. Okay, so we have a special evening planned for you tonight. In just a moment, I will ask our guest, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, to join me on stage for a conversation about her highly acclaimed new memoir, No Higher Honor. I will have the chance to ask her some questions about the book and then give you in the audience a chance as well. But first, I have the honor of formally introducing her. And perhaps I should not use the word formally. For someone like Dr. Rice, who around here is considered family, we should really dispense with the formalities. I could recite her extraordinary resume as I have in the past when she's been here. That she was a spectacular national security advisor and Secretary of State for President George W. Bush. That she has served under 3 United States presidents, including Ronald Reagan, with great distinction. That she is already an acclaimed author, this being her 5th book, which I know, like her last, is fast becoming a bestseller. And finally, that she holds titles of distinction as a professor and as a fellow at Stanford University, presently ranked number 9 in the college football standings. Okay, but instead of diving deeper into her resume, because she's family, and all of you are family as well, what I'd like to do is invite you into our living room, so to speak, and, well, present you with a quick sideshow of what she did for her summer vacation. Yeah, well, I know some of you are thinking, oh, not one of those endless slideshows where before dinner where, the person's lounging at the pool or in front of the Grand Canyon or playing golf or something like that. While I personally think that would be fun to watch, the slides for Dr. Rice's summer vacation will be brief and for fans of Ronald Reagan, really quite meaningful. I say this because our dear friend and family member, the 66th Secretary of State, spent her summer vacation honoring President Reagan around the world. Asked by Mrs. Reagan to represent her during the Reagan Centennial, the celebrations in Europe, she not only said yes, she answered in world-class fashion with performances that honored the president like I've seen from no other. From Budapest to Prague to London, she evoked the memory and the legacy of President Reagan to crowds of thousands celebrating his centennial. So let's start with Budapest. This is Secretary Rice speaking right before the unveiling of a statue of President Reagan in Freedom Square in Budapest. And there we have her with the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister unveiling this incredible statue of the President there in Freedom Square. This is her speaking that evening to an event hosted by the President of Hungary. And then we're off to Prague. In Prague, she spoke at a conference that we sponsored with a think tank there in the Czech Republic. This is her toasting the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. This is Secretary Rice just before she unveiled a brand new avenue in Prague, downtown Prague, right in front of the ambassador's residence. That's the ambassador sitting there having a laugh. And there she is unveiling the street itself, Ronaldo Renega, the new street after Ronald Reagan. And then off to London, where the Secretary spoke just before the unveiling of the statue of President Reagan in front of the U.S. Embassy at Grosvenor Square. Then a dinner that evening at Guildhall, the famous Guildhall where President Reagan spoke in 1983 to over 1,000 people. Really quite an affair. So with that, I just want to say, Madam Secretary, I know that Mrs. Reagan and everyone here cannot thank you enough for taking such valuable time out of your life to honor the President, and for that, we honor you tonight. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Condoleezza Rice. So are you. Right here. Right here.
Thank you very much. What a delight to be here. And thank you very much again, Mrs. Reagan, for inviting me here. And I only wish it had been last week when we were ranked 4th in the BCS Hall.
Yes, I know I had to change the number from 4 to 9.
Yes, right.
Madam Secretary, what a book. 750 pages of just incredible material. And as I read it, it felt to me like you must keep a diary. You just must, because the amount of detail in there was just phenomenal. How do you keep track of all those things?
Well, I did not keep a diary. The fact is that after you've worked at this all day, you don't want to go home and write down what you've done. And so I did, however, have access to my calendar, and very often there were important notations on my calendar. I actually, like the academic that I am, went to both the Bush Library and to my State Department papers and spent time with them myself to remember how events had transpired. And then I had the good fortune to spend some time with people who had worked with me for recollection and recalling. So we put the picture together in that way. But it was really a great fun to go back and look back over all of this.
Yeah, it's a great read. It really is. Can you take us back to 9/11? There's a story inside your book where you talk about what you had to tell the president when he was outside of Washington. And in particular, inside that story is the decision you talk about that he had to make with respect to Flight 93. Can you bring us back to that point?
Well, on the day of 9/11, I was at my desk at the White House, and it was ironic that President Bush had gone for a 4-hour event in Florida. You'll remember he went for an education event. And on any day when he traveled, because he's always president of the United States, even if he traveled domestically, either I would go with him or Steve Hadley, the deputy, would go with him. This particular day, we decided he's only going to be gone 4 hours. Neither of us went with him. So ironically, on that day, he was out without his national security advisors. I was standing at my desk, and my assistant handed me a note that said a plane had hit the World Trade Center. I thought, well, that's a strange accident. And then I got a note that a second plane had hit the World Trade Center, and I thought, my God, this is a terrorist attack. And I went to the Situation Room to try to call the national security principals. George Tenet, the CIA director, had already gone to the bunker. Colin Powell was coming back from Peru, and I couldn't reach Don Rumsfeld. His phone was just ringing and ringing and ringing. And I looked behind me on television, a plane had hit the Pentagon. And at that point, the Secret Service came and they said, you have got to go to a bunker. The planes are flying into buildings all over Washington. The White House has got to be next. And at that point, the Secret Service doesn't so much escort you to the bunker. They kind of lift you, and I kind of vaguely remember being levitated toward the bunker. And I said, but wait, I have to make a phone call. So first I called my aunt and uncle, because you have to know the Rices and the Rays. They would have made their way to Washington, D.C. had they not heard from me. So I called them. And then I talked to the president, and I said, he said, I'm coming back. And I did something I'd never done before and never did after. I raised my voice to the president of the United States. I said, stay where you are. We're under attack. I mean, the United States is under attack. And then getting to the bunker, the vice president was talking with the president, who had told him to pass an order to the U.S. Air Force that if a plane did not identify itself properly, we should shoot it down. And I thought to myself what a Hobson choice that was for the President of the United States to have to perhaps shoot down a civilian aircraft, because every plane now was a potential missile. And when a plane went off the radar screen, we thought for 15 awful minutes that perhaps we'd shot it down. The vice president kept trying to get confirmation from the Pentagon. He kept saying, you must know if you engaged a civilian aircraft. We can't confirm, we can't confirm. It was, of course, the plane that went down in that Pennsylvania field that had been driven into the ground by the passengers. But for that horrible moment, we thought perhaps the U.S. Air Force had shot down a civilian aircraft.
There's some passage in your book that I thought read like a spy novel, and I thought a story you might want to relay is this conversation that you had with your deputy at the time, I think Steve Hadley, where it talks about mice with feet up or feet down.
Yeah, right.
Can you talk to us about that?
Well, we had postponed the Asia-Pacific Economic Council meetings, which were supposed to be on September 15th, until the couple of weeks into October. And so here we were in Shanghai, President Bush, Colin Powell, Andy Cart, the Chief of Staff, and me. But every morning in China's time, we would have a video conference with Steve Hadley, the deputy, and with the vice president, who were back in D.C. Now, in this particular moment, you could just see that the vice president was gray. I mean, you could see it through the video. And the president said, "Good morning, Dick. What's going on?" The vice president said, "Mr. President, the White House detectors have detected the deadly nerve agent botulinum toxin. There is no known antidote, and those of us who have been exposed are going to die." And the president said, "What was that again, Dick?" And Colin Powell said, "What's the exposure time?" Thinking, well, maybe I wasn't in the White House during the exposure time. He was. And so the president said, "Go call Hadley and find out what's going on." So I called Steve Hadley, and he said, "Yes." He said, "Now it could be a false alarm." He said, "But we've sent the samples to the CDC." And Steve's a Midwesterner with a wicked sense of humor. And he said, "Let me put it this way. If the mice are feet down, we're fine. If the mice are feet up, we're toast." So 24 hours, we're in Shanghai. We don't know the outcome of these tests. Finally, I get a note that Steve Hadley's on the phone. We're at a luncheon with the Chinese. Steve says, "Good news, the mice are feet down." And so I go back to the president, and who's sitting next to the Chinese president. I say, "Mr. President, the mice are feet down." The president says, "Oh, thank goodness, the mice are feet down." And I'm sure that the Chinese are thinking, what code are they speaking in by this time?
Those slides I showed. Right before you arrived in Europe, we had an event in Krakow, in Poland, at the famous St. Mary's Basilica, the parish of Pope John Paul.
Yes.
And it was a terrific mass in honor of President Reagan and Pope John Paul, just tremendous allies. And it reminded me, when I read your book, you have a story in there too about Pope John Paul, and I thought maybe you'd want to tell that.
Well, as a student of the Soviet Union and communism, I was well aware when the College of Cardinals elected a Pole to be the Pope. And he became really a tremendous ally of President Reagan's in the fight to end tyranny in Eastern Europe, the moral authority really to do that. When the Pope died, we went to the funeral. I was with President Clinton, President George H.W. Bush, and President Bush and Laura Bush. We were the official delegation. And the Mass that day, it was a high Mass, 3-hour Mass, and it had been very cold and windy all day. And at the end of the Mass, the crowds in the square, in Basilica Square, were waving, 1 million people waving flags of solidarity and the Polish flag. The bells were tolling from the Basilica. The choir was singing this ethereal music, and the pallbearers came down and they lifted the coffin. They started back up the stairs of the Basilica, and they turned the coffin toward the crowd, and the sun broke out. And it was just startling. And I was standing next to Laura Bush, and she said, "Did you see that?" And I was sort of struck dumb, really. I asked many people after if the press had reported that moment, and people said no. And then I began to think, well, maybe it was something that only believers saw. But I remembered going back through the Basilica and passing the Pieta and thanking God for the gift of eternal life, because if ever I had seen a demonstration of the promise of the resurrection, it was in that moment.
Now, it seemed to me that the Bush presidency, in many respects, could be defined as a really tough one. 2 wars, Hurricane Katrina, towards the end, the financial collapse, all those things. And then I read in your book early on, during some of these really stressful times, and I think you were just getting to build a working relationship with the president. You noted that you had to have words with him. And it was about him maybe finishing a sentence of yours or two. Can you talk about that? Because I thought, boy, what a moment that was.
Well, President Bush and I, as he would tell leaders, he said, she's like my sister. We came to this together, he said, because we actually started together in 1999, early in 1999, and so we'd been through a lot together. And sometimes when you know someone too well, you have a tendency to sort of take them for granted sitting there. And so we would be in meetings, and I would start to say something, he'd finish my sentence. And finally, I said to him, I asked to see him in the Oval Office. You never do these things in public at all. And so I asked him to see him in the Oval Office, and I said, you know, I know you mean well, and I know you think you know what I'm about to say, but it really doesn't look good in front of others if you keep finishing my sentences. They're going to think you don't value what I say. And he was crestfallen, and then I felt really bad, and then he felt really bad, and it was really, but we got the balance a little bit better after that.
A more contemporary topic, but it also has roots in your book, the Arab Spring, something we've heard all about, which now is turning into the Arab Winter. And there is a piece in your book which is about your meeting with President Mubarak and kind of some regrets that are there. Can you talk about that?
Well, for 60 years, the United States had pursued a policy in the Middle East of Middle East exceptionalism, while we had advocated so strongly for democratic principles all over the world, for the view that no man, woman, or child should ever live in tyranny, something that, of course, President Reagan was so closely associated with. The Middle East had always been treated a little bit differently. You know, it was about stability. And we had these authoritarian friends who were supposedly keeping stability in the Middle East. And after 9/11, it became really clear that this was a false stability in the Middle East, that underneath there was a seething anger that in its worst expression was Al-Qaeda. And so we, first with President Bush's second inaugural address in which he said that we should end tyranny, and then with a speech that I gave in Cairo in June of 2005, we decided that we had to launch a freedom agenda that would encourage our friends and warn our foes for political reform. I went to see President Mubarak the morning before I was to give that speech at the American University of Cairo. I didn't want to surprise him by what I was going to say, and he said, give your speech. He said, you don't know my people. They need a strong hand. They don't like foreigners telling them what to do. He said, and all that stands between my people and the Muslim Brotherhood is me. And of course, these authoritarians had engaged in policies to make that true, because while the decent political forces were hounded by the secret police and their internet sites shut down, the radicals organized in the radical madrasas and the radical mosques. And so there's a reason that the most organized forces today in the Middle East are actually the extremist forces, the Islamists. I gave the speech. As I sat there watching Mubarak, confused really about what was happening to him, I thought if only he'd carried through with reforms, he might have been in happy retirement in Sharm el-Sheikh. We tried to warn our friends that you reform before people are in the streets. Because once your people are in the streets, once they've lost the fear of an authoritarian regime, and fear is all that separates an authoritarian from his people. Once they've lost their fear, it's replaced with anger. And anger is a terrible way to make political reform. And that's what we're experiencing in the Middle East now, is reform that has come late. And so it's going to be chaotic, and it's going to be troubling, and there will be ugly parts of it because revolutions are never pretty. But I said in London that one could imagine that if Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were, as I would imagine Ronald Reagan is, looking down us, they would say something like, don't lose your nerve now. These values are universal. They will triumph. You cannot all of a sudden decide that there are people who aren't ready for freedom. This will end up with history's arc bending toward justice.
Well, speaking of authoritarian regimes, Gaddafi. He is one of the more interesting and odd fellows
Yeah, that's
in
one
your
way to
book.
put it. Yeah.
Well, and now that he's met his demise, I know you probably won't need to expect any late night phone calls from him.
Or any more
But can you
scrapbooks,
take
yeah.
us through that oddity, your
Yeah.
take on that?
No, I went to Libya to open relations with Libya because Gaddafi had given up his weapons of mass destruction in the wake of the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. I was, by the way, as he was in that bunker in those last days, very glad that we had dismantled his weapons of mass destruction, which I'm quite sure he might have used in those last days. He had paid reparations to the victims of terrorism from the Pan Am bombing. And so I was to go and open up relations. And as I was getting ready and planning the trip, I kept hearing from foreign minister friends and our Africanists and others that Gaddafi had this kind of bizarre fascination with me. And I thought, okay, but you still have to go do your diplomatic thing and then get out of there. And so we had a fairly normal, for Gaddafi, diplomatic exchange. And it was, we were done, and then he wanted to have dinner in his kitchen. So we had dinner in the family kitchen. And all the time I'm thinking, okay, this is going okay. And then he said, I have a video for you. I thought, oh, no. And it was actually a fairly innocent video of me with Putin and me with Hu Jintao, but it was set to a song that he had written by Libya's best composer called Black Flower in the White House. And I thought, just get on the plane for Algeria and forget that this all happened. So I did, and look, he met his demise violently. That's what happens in revolutions, and the Libyan people have a chance now. It's a tough place because Libya is really a collection of tribes. It was held together by this cult of personality. They're going to have to work very hard to find institutions where people will actually use those institutions to protect and carry forward their interests. But at least they've got a chance.
Let's spin the clock forward about the fifth, or right around the 5th year of your time when you were freshly, a new Secretary of State. And it's the 5th anniversary of 9/11. And you're standing on the White House lawn. Tell us that story.
Yes, well, it was the 5th anniversary of 9/11, and we always had a moment of silence on the White House lawn. And this one, the president had gone to New York to lead the anniversary commemorations there. The vice president was leading the moment of silence, and as we were starting the moment of silence, I saw a plane on approach from Reagan. And all of a sudden I panicked. It looked like it was coming right at us. And of course it was on a normal path, but it was a flashback. And I said to myself, I've had enough. I can't do this anymore. And tomorrow, when I come back from Canada, because I was going to go to Canada to thank the Canadian people in Halifax for what they've done in helping us on that day, I said, I'm going to go and I'm going to tell the president that I'm leaving. And fortunately, I went to Canada. Peter MacKay, the Canadian foreign minister and somebody who's become a really good friend, had planned a really rather low-key event after we had thanked the people who had helped us. He had a kind of family event. And somehow I was more rested and more relaxed by the time I came back. But there was that moment when I thought, I just can't do this anymore.
Tomorrow, some of us leave for Warsaw, Tbilisi, Vilnius, to almost a redux of the trip that you were on in the summer. So we have an extra ticket. I was wondering if you...
Oh. I'd love to, but I have to teach, There's a job at Stanford.
But on the Georgia front, a great chapter in your book about the war, the recent war in Georgia, and the ramifications of what I believe the Russian foreign minister was trying to get you to do. Can you talk about that?
Well, of course, we had been trying for a year to prevent conflict between the Russians and the Georgians because you could see it building. The Russians were doing all manner of nasty things to the Georgians. We were afraid the Georgians would be provoked because the Russians wanted a war. Putin in particular had a strong, strong dislike for Mikhail Saakashvili, the democratically elected president of Georgia. And unfortunately, on August 7th, war broke out. And I was on the phone with the Russian foreign minister right away, and we had a fairly normal conversation about what to do. And then second time that he called, he said, all right, I want you to know what Moscow's demands are. And he said, the Georgians have to return to their barracks, take their troops back to their barracks. I said, done. He said, the Georgians will have to sign a no use of force pledge. We had been trying to get the Georgians to do that. I said, done. He said, the third demand will be just between us. It'll be a secret between us. I thought, what is this? And he said, Misha Saakashvili has got to go. And I acted from instinct, not from thinking it through. I said, the Secretary of State of the United States of America and the Foreign Minister of Russia do not have a secret conversation about the overthrow of the democratically elected president of Georgia. And therefore, I'm about to get off this phone and call everybody that I can and tell them that that is Russia's demand to overthrow the president of Georgia. He said, I said this was between us. I said, no, this can't be between us. And then I did. I called the Brits. I called the French. I had our representative at the UN inform the Security Council that this was the Russian demand. Sergei Lavrov was furious with me. He said that he'd never had a colleague do that to him. But in that moment, I could sniff just a little bit of the smell or hear just a little bit of the echo of how the Soviets treated their neighbors in the old days in the Cold War. And I wasn't going to be party to letting it happen again.
Let's talk for a minute about Pakistan. You know, very, very much in the news these days. And I know that the clock has ticked forward a little bit since you left the State Department. But with the killing of Osama bin Laden there, the purported ties of the Pakistani intelligence service to our enemies fighting us in Afghanistan, the thought that maybe their intelligence service, you know, he was hiding in plain sight. So I wonder, friend or foe?
Yeah. Well, Pakistan is an incredibly troubled place. And I don't believe that at the highest levels of the Pakistani government, they are harboring extremists. But at some levels of the security forces, there have to be people who know what's going on. Osama bin Laden couldn't hide for that long in essentially a suburb of their West Point and not have somebody know. And even if they are not complicit at very high levels, which I don't think that they are, they don't have the sense of urgency about doing something about the extremism in their midst that they really need to have. After all, the extremists killed Benazir Bhutto. This is a problem for Pakistan, not just for the United States or for Afghanistan. And I worry that as we prepare to draw down in Afghanistan, there are a lot of things we can accomplish. We can, I believe, train Afghan security forces that are capable of preventing an existential threat to the Afghan government. We can help the Afghans find more decent governance in some of their provinces and even in Kabul. But I worry that the instability in Pakistan and the deep embedding of the extremism there makes it hard for that border between Pakistan and Afghanistan to sustain a peaceful future for Afghanistan. So it's high time that the Pakistanis start really rooting out extremists. You know, they still look, their army still looks like they're going to fight the Indians in Kashmir. Now, the fact is that it's still a very volatile situation in Kashmir, but the Indians want to do Bangalore and Mumbai and Bollywood, and they want to be on the Security Council. They don't really want to fight the Pakistanis in Kashmir. They need to come to a decision about that and end that conflict, because the Pakistanis have much more important work to do in the northwest frontier and in the tribal areas where the extremists are still very deeply embedded.
One last question from me, and then we'll take it out to you in the audience. Iran.
Yeah.
So is it possible, do you think, for the nuclear genie to go back in the bottle there peacefully, or do you think, no way, this is going to end up in a military confrontation?
Well, the President of the United States cannot take the military option off the table because the Iranians have to know that if it comes to that, the United States is not prepared to sit by and let them become a nuclear power. So that option has to remain on the table. I personally believe, and just reading between the lines, I don't have any special information, but I can see from what the IAEA is reporting and from some of the reports that are coming out, the Iranians have had some trouble in their program. And there probably is still time for what I'll call coercive diplomacy. Not a lot of talking, but it's time to really take the toughest measures against the Iranians that we possibly can. Now, if the Russians and the Chinese won't go along with it, then we need to gather up the Japanese and the Australians and the Europeans and whomever else we can. And we can do a lot of harm to the Iranian economy, which is already weak. We could, it's a very tough measure, but we could sanction the central bank. And if you do that, they can't use the international financial system. You could embargo oil and gas, going both ways. They import 40% of their refined product. People say, well, an embargo at this point, the weak global economy, but if you want to see a weak global economy, let the Iranians have a nuclear weapon. So there are tough choices here. We can do more. It's one reason that I'm sorry we won't have a residual force in Iraq. We can do more to make the Iranians' lives miserable if they try to cause trouble in Iraq. So there are a lot of things that we can do to Iran, and it's a dangerous regime because it's the trifecta. It represses its own people, 70% of whom, by the way, are under the age of 30 in Iran. They are seeking a nuclear weapon, and they are the poster child for state sponsorship of terrorism. So they are the most dangerous single country, but it's a weak government, and I think enough pressure on it and they will either change their policies or that regime will change. This is a time, you know, I think back to when President Reagan in 81, 82 challenged the Soviet Union and I think understood better than all of the Soviet specialists, the present company included, that the Soviet Union was a fundamentally weak regime. And that if you pressured it, as he said, it would end up on the ash heap of history. And of course, it did end up on the ash heap of history. The Iranians don't have 30,000 nuclear weapons as the Soviet Union did. They don't have 5 million men under arms as the Soviet Union did. They don't span 12 time zones as the Soviet Union did. I'm quite certain that if we could pressure the Soviet Union, we can pressure what I think is a fairly weak Iranian regime.
Well said. Dr. Rice has been kind enough to agree to take some questions from the audience. So all I ask of you is if you have a question, if you raise your hand, if you could wait before you ask, we'll hand a microphone to you, okay? So I think we have one right here.
First of all, thank you so much, and thank you so much for all the garbage you put up with in order to help our country.
Thank you.
That was just lovely to watch. But I was thinking about your latest comment about if President Reagan could pressure Russia into caving under its own corruption, then we certainly can do this with such a tiny country as Iran. But the reality is we don't have a leader like President Reagan. And I was wondering, I'm sure you don't want to say if there's anyone you think that's in the running, but what are the qualities you think we need in our next leader, God willing?
Right, thank you. Well, I'll come to your second question, but let me just say, you know, it is true, President Obama and his administration came to power. They were going to reach out a hand of friendship to the Iranians. Well, the Iranians bit it off. And actually now, I think they see that this regime is dangerous. And so I would not be too surprised if you see a pretty tough line toward the Iranians, and we really need one. What I think we're looking for, and what the question questions I'm looking to be answered. First and foremost, what do you see the role of the United States as being in the world? Do you think the United States is exceptional? If we're not exceptional, then the United States, which has borne all of these costs for decades now to build a balance of power that favors freedom, we have no right to ask the American people for those sacrifices if we're just any other country. And so, do you believe that the United States is exceptional in the world? Secondly, do you believe that it is in our interest, as well in support of our values, to work for that balance of power that favors freedom? And what do we do to advance those values? Third, and perhaps most important, what are you going to do the job of internal repair in the United States so that we have a confident foundation from which to lead? I'm a specialist in international relations, but I'm not at all disturbed by the fact that number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 right now is the economic mess in which we find ourselves. Stop spending money that we're borrowing that we can't afford. Stop telling me that we can just go the way we've gone with entitlements and everything will be all right. We've got to do something about K-12 education, which is robbing the least of our kids of a future. We've got to do something about immigration policy, where we've got a patchwork of state policies that are not serving us well, because we are a country of immigrants. We have to remember that. And so I'm looking for a lot of answers about our internal repair, because the United States of America will not lead if we're not confident. Now, I think that the questions that come in these debates, what will you do about Afghanistan? What will you do about Iran? What will you do about China? Let me tell you something. On day one, when you walk into the Oval Office, I don't care what answers you've given, you're suddenly going to look and say, oh my goodness, is this what it's really like? And all of a sudden, you're going to realize that you can't really turn that big aircraft carrier of US foreign policy on a dime. And so I'm actually less interested in answers to specific policy questions than I am to the character and the timbre and the principles of the person that we're going to put in the Oval Office, because whatever flaws you have outside will be magnified once you're in there. So I'm looking for character tests and tests of principle.
Thank you.
How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
I have a question. Since the United Nations was formed, they have taken actions in many, many countries throughout the world. I can't name one single country where, wherever their actions have taken place, that they have left that country in a condition anywhere near equal to that, the freedom that we have in the United States. Can you?
Well, let me speak to the broader question of the UN. Look, the UN is a mixed bag, all right? I have nothing for the General Assembly to do, nothing. There are agencies of the UN that I think are more trouble than they're worth. When UNESCO seated the Palestinians over the objections of the United States, I agree, withdraw your support from UNESCO. But you know, there are actually some parts of the UN apparatus that you would not want to be without. The World Health Organization is an institution that really, on something like the SARS or avian flu, is absolutely critical. UNICEF is really a good organization for children. It really is. I know this organization, and it's usually, by the way, has been run by some very good Americans, including Ann Veneman, who used to be the Secretary of Agriculture here in the state of California and was the Secretary of Agriculture for President Bush after having been the deputy for President George H.W. Bush. And so there are some good agencies of the UN. There are also some peacekeeping operations that you would not want to be without, because we would be doing the peacekeeping in places like Cote d'Ivoire and some of the nastier places like Haiti, where it was a UN peacekeeping operation. But the truth of the matter is, the UN qua UN, especially the Security Council, has a hard time doing anything difficult because it's just a collection of states. And that's why I've never believed that we ought to be hostage to Security Council resolutions to defend and protect our interest. When we needed to do the job in Kosovo under the Clinton administration, they did it under NATO, not under the UN. When we needed to do the job in Iraq, we believed that 16 Security Council resolutions were enough. And so we then defended our interest. And so there are some parts of the UN that I think are really very much worth preserving. But remember, the UN is a collection of member states. And when you get that many member states together, it's very hard to get them to do something hard, which is why sometimes the United States has to do it with a coalition of the willing instead.
We have time for like 2 more questions. We'll take one right here.
Hi, Dr. Rice.
Hi.
Again, I'd like to thank you. I'm sure you're aware of how many young women in this country look up to you, including myself.
Thank you.
My question is regarding Israel. Under the current president, I feel our alliance with them is deteriorated quite rapidly, and I want to know your thoughts on what the next president can do to repair that relationship. I think it's important.
Well, thank you. Well, the first thing to always remember about Israel is that it is a democracy in a really hostile neighborhood. And but for the perseverance of the Israeli people, a lot of toughness, sometimes a little ruthlessness, the Jewish Democratic State of Israel would have ceased to exist a long time ago. And so this is a country that quite rightly recognizes and believes that its neighbors would have happily wiped it into the sea if it could have. And that's why they're very tough and tough people. They also recognize that they need the friendship of the United States, and that it has been, since Harry Truman recognized the State of Israel in 1948 against the wishes of even the great George Marshall, the Israelis have looked to the United States to be their friend. And I don't believe that we have any greater or more important friend in the world than the State of Israel. And I think we have to act that way. Now, when the Israelis feel that support from the United States, when they feel that we're there with them, they will take difficult decisions in the peace process. Ariel Sharon took very difficult decisions, but he knew that the President of the United States backed him. And so, both because Israel is our friend and a democracy, and because it makes the search for peace easier, we need to have a solid relationship with the Israelis. It doesn't mean that we don't criticize them. I used to criticize them. It doesn't mean that we always agree. But it does mean that you always realize how very critical that relationship is, and it has to go both ways. Now, I think that the biggest mistake that the administration made with Israel was to ask for or to demand a settlement freeze as a precondition for the peace talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians. No Israeli prime minister, I don't care where he is on the political spectrum, can agree to a settlement freeze. And once you've demanded a settlement freeze, Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian, can't be less Palestinian than the Americans. So of course now he's got to demand a settlement freeze as a precondition too, even though he never demanded a precondition of a settlement freeze when we were there. So we do have some work to do in our relationship with Israel. It's a strong and solid relationship, and so I think the foundation is still there. But I would just ask anybody who's in the Oval Office to remember the precarious position of Israel in the world and to act accordingly.
We've got time for one last question. We'll go up here to the balcony. Yes.
Madam Secretary, thank you for your time
yes,
today,
yes.
and thank you for your service to our country. My question is around China. If you had the opportunity to give President Obama a consult today on China, what might be some of the things that you might share with him regarding your thoughts on where our relationship is with China today? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let me not give the president, the current president, advice. You know, he's got his advisors, but let me give anybody who would want to be president the following advice about China. China is an economic miracle. Right? I was first in China in Beijing in 1988. The streets of Beijing were a competition between a few horse carts, a few automobiles, and a whole lot of bicycles. That's not Beijing today. They've lifted 500 million people out of poverty, but they've got several hundred million more to go. They are trying to move as many as 300 million people from those 19th century villages into the cities over the next decade. That means they're going to be creating a new New York every few months. Now, in that kind of rapid social and economic change, there are bound to be strains and stresses, and there are strains and stresses. 180,000 reported riots last year in China. The labor markets are now, people are demanding higher labor wages. So China's no longer going to be the low-cost wage provider in the international economy. Product safety problems. You've seen about the bullet trains that literally almost fell off the tracks. I mean, this is a place that's got a lot of strains. And it is a leadership that's not all that confident. When you are so terrified of the internet that you're hacking into people's servers to find that one last human rights advocate out there, you're not very confident. And yet, there they are controlling the internet and keeping the filters. And the blogosphere is going crazy as a young girl is left beside the road to die, who's 2 years old, and the Chinese are saying, what kind of people have we become? Perhaps that is the reason that Wen Jiabao, the premier, said maybe we need political reform, not just economic reform. And he was actually censored on Chinese television the first couple of times. Then he said, well, you know, the Chinese people elect their village leaders. Maybe they could elect their local leaders. Well, excuse me, Premier Wen, but what then about their provincial leaders? And then what about their national leaders? So China is not 10 feet tall. It is an economic miracle, but it has a lot of problems. And one other final one. You know, sometimes when you mess with nature, you get in trouble. One-child policy sounded like a great idea to stop the population explosion. But a funny thing happens when you have only one child. If you're out in the hinterlands, you want a boy. So a lot of girls disappeared, and now 30 million Chinese men don't have mates. And the Chinese demographics are fast approaching European and Japanese demographics, where replacement workers are no longer outpacing retiring workers. So this is a place that is not 10 feet tall. That said, if the United States does not somehow reinvigorate our strengths, then we get what we deserve. China becomes a consequential challenger to us in ways that we cannot confront. First and foremost, as I said earlier, get our own economic house in order. Because while I don't believe that the Chinese who are borrowing, or from whom we're borrowing, can really use that against us in any way, because they're putting their money into safe havens when they put it into the United States. That's what they're doing. Nonetheless, you know, let's not tempt them by continuing to borrow more money than we can afford. Secondly, if we get our economic house in order, then we're not going to be threatened by the growing Chinese economy. And third, as to military matters, the Chinese are spending more on their military than one would expect given regional aspirations as opposed to global aspirations. But there are three things we can do about that. The first is we can strengthen our alliances, which together give us much greater military capability than China will have for many, many, many decades. Japan, South Korea, Australia, Southeast Asia, even a budding relationship with India, which is now willing to buy our military equipment. And if we also keep our own technological edge militarily, it will be many, 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 many decades before the Chinese even begin to approach us. But we have to be careful. We can't afford $550 billion defense budgets out into the future. And the Chinese are not going to challenge us in traditional ways. They're going to challenge us in cyber, and they're going to challenge us in space. So we have to be smart about what we do with our own technology to meet the challenges. But I'm an optimist, and you know, as a kind of closing point, I'd just like to say that I think all of the challenges that we have are we're more than capable of meeting them. The United States has long been a place that has met these challenges because we've had a particular spirit about what it means to be American. You know, you can come from humble circumstances, you can do great things, doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. And that's actually led us to be a people who believe what my parents taught me. You may not be able to control your circumstances, but you can control your response to your circumstances. And that then has led us never to be a people who were aggrieved, why don't they give me? Or entitled, why aren't they giving me? Why don't I have? I think a little of that is creeping into our national character. And it's becoming somebody else's fault. If I don't have it, it's somebody's fault. If they didn't give it to me, it's somebody's fault. I think that's the work of the next leader of the United States of America, to remind us that once you give in to aggrievement and its twin brother, entitlement, you've lost control of your lives. And that's never, even in the darkest times, in the darkest of circumstances, been the way that Americans thought.
Well said.